Okay, here we're looking at part two, looking at social psychology. Our focus here is going to be looking at what is an attitude. Not the one you get from your kids or the one you maybe express yourself, please don't give me that attitude. But it's around about what is attitude. Where does it come from? What is it? How do we form it? And we're going to look at some of the conditions about that. We're also going to look at the role of persuasion. Now, we've often seen ourselves being persuaded by people, and we maybe even influenced and persuaded other people to do things they didn't think they would do. But how does it work? So we're going to look at that as well. We're also going to look at what would be considered topics you may already be familiar with, but it's from a social psychology perspective. We're going to look at prejudice, discrimination, stereotypes, and theories that explain why those things exist in our society the way they are. We're also going to look at pro-social behavior. And pro-social behavior really is when we go out of our way to help other people, that is exhibiting pro-social behavior. So we're going to look at why do we do good things. And then lastly, we'll look at aggression. Aggression has many sources. We'll look at some of the theories and the expressions of aggression and how social psychologists consider it. Okay, when we're looking at attitude and attitude change, we need to consider, what it is. It's a relatively stable evaluation of a person, an object, a situation, or an issue along a continuum ranging from positive and negative. So there's a lot of stuff in between, not just positive and just not negative. But it is made up of three different components: cognitive, emotional, and behavioral. When you think cognitive, think thinking. And so cognitive is the things or the thoughts and the beliefs that we have about attitudinal object or the people or a situation or an issue. So cognitive are our thoughts, and it's linked to our emotional states, feelings about things like attitudinal object. And that relates again to the behavioral disposition that we'll have towards those objects and the actions that we'll take. So thoughts are the thoughts, emotions are the reflective experience that we have about those thoughts, and then those emotions link to the behaviors and the actions that we take. It's acquired by first-hand experience or observing people, objects, situations, or issues, and we get that through the observation through mass media, and it's strengthened through the association with others with whom we share them with. And so what I've got here on the next slide is what's in your textbook, just to give you a reminder. There's the definition and how they're related, and you can use that as your guide as well. Now, one of the other terms that is used in social psychology is what's called cognitive dissonance, and this is where the unpleasant state that can occur when people become aware of inconsistencies between their attitudes or between their attitudes and their behavior. And so this can result from a desire to maintain our self-esteem and reduce the discomfort, or people will try to reduce their cognitive dissonance by changing their behaviors or changing their attitudes, explaining away the inconsistency or minimizing its importance. And so cognitive dissonance is really these sorts of confusions that we have about what we think and what we do, and that inconsistency can cause anxiety, if you will, and disturbance. So we try to rectify that when we feel them. Otherwise, it continues to be a problem for us. Now, one of the other areas in which social psychologists like to spend some time exploring is when they look at persuasion and how we, explore that. And by definition, it's a deliberate attempt to influence the attitudes and or the behavior of another person. And there's a few elements of persuasion, and we're going to identify four. One is the source of the communication, and that is essentially influence is increased when the source of the communication has credibility, whether that's the person has credibility and we see the credibility in them, either we've known them from some other area and we see them and we go, oh, that person knows what they're talking about, or they will be, as their experience has brought them credibility. Maybe they have expertise, or we see them as trustworthy, attractive, or likability. You might know in the news lately that Brian Williams of NBC has gone through some troubles. He's a newscaster and had very high ranking among what would be considered trustworthiness in news broadcasting.
and he had some false memories about his time covering a story, and it's caused some grief for him around his credibility. And so he's had to step away because, as a source of communication, as a news broadcaster, his credibility has been brought into question. And so, in terms of persuasion, credibility becomes very important. Now, the second part is that of the audience. And based on if I'm the persuader, I must consider who is my audience to know what degree of persuasion or strategy I may need to use. The smarter the audience, the more difficult it is to persuade them. The message, this is what is being said. So, in order to persuade, we must ensure that our message is clear, is convincing, is persuasive. And then the medium would be the means by which we transmit that. Now, whether that's through our own voice and talking to people, whether that's through social media, whether that's through television, whether that's through newsprint, whether that is whatever medium can either assist or diminish our ability to persuade. So carrying on with persuasion, one-sided messages, these are ones where they're more persuasive if the audience is not very informed. So we pass this information on you, you're not that informed, you will accept this information more easily. Whereas two-sided messages are best when audiences are well informed, fairly intelligent, and initially opposed to the point of view you're trying to convince them of. Appeals based on fear are most effective when definitive actions are outlined so the audience can avoid them. So in order to, you quit smoking because you've seen a nasty picture of a lung or throat cancer. For some, that is the kind of fear that sort of says, okay, I don't want to do that. And then, there's some other definitive actions that you should be taking. Nutritional messages are often more effective when the benefits are outlined. You take this, eat these sorts of foods. Here are the benefits that you could generate. Two-sided appeals will have more sway than one-sided. Repetition, the more often you see it. I put the Viagra one up there because for a while Viagra was in our faces a lot in terms of advertising, and that tends to improve the likelihood that people would be persuaded to use that particular product. We'll judge such arguments, or we'll judge arguments as being weaker, and some will just judge as being stronger based on how well we are convinced of it or persuaded of it. Messages are less persuasive if vivid elements are included. Colorful language and striking examples are useful in terms of persuasive messages. And so we see some of our persuasion being used when we're trying to develop, if you will, a sense about prejudice and discrimination and campaigns against. So by definition, prejudice is the attitudes, usually negative, towards others based on their gender, their religion, their race, or membership of a particular group. Now, these are attitudes which involve our beliefs and our emotions. They're usually negative, but these are all in our head. Prejudices are thoughts, our thinking, our attitudes. They aren't expressed. Okay, whereas discrimination, these are behaviors, again, usually negative, directed towards individuals based on their gender, their religion, their race, their membership of a particular group. For example, minority racial groups, and it's called racism. Women, where it's sexism. The group of handicapped people. Religious groups, the elderly, which is ageism. But also, if you're young and you're discriminated against because you're young, that's also ageism. Or sexual orientation. These are all things that when behaviors are acted towards those groups of people, we would call that discrimination. Now, and there are theories, of course, about some of this, but one theory is what's called realistic conflict theory. The view is that as competition increases among social groups for scarce resources, so do prejudices, so do discriminations, and so do hatred. The Native Americans and settlers in the U.S. experienced this in part because of the experience of perceived scarce resources. And a part of this is generated by there being two groups, in-groups and out-groups. In-groups would be the social group with strong sense of togetherness and formed and from which others are excluded. So if you think of the group that you hang around with, that would be your in-group. Now you may have more than one in-group, but you can discern an in-group by knowing that there are some people who are in, and there are people that you deliberately or you overtly or even inadvertently exclude. If someone from an out group tries to come into the in-group will sometimes try to make sure they don't get in. And so the in-group are the strong sense of togetherness that you have with people whom you associate with. We see this in college fraternities, sororities, and social groups and social clubs. Now, out-groups, on the other hand, these are made up of individuals specifically identified by the in-group as not belonging. I know from my own experience when I was in high school, there were the academic kids, the geeks, if you will, and then there were the jocks, and the two don't mix. So geeks don't join the jocks, and jocks don't join the geeks. And so there was clear distinction of in-groups and out-groups. And so you know who belonged and who didn't belong. This can lead to the us versus them thinking, which in some cases, if you're cheering for your team versus another team, that's an acceptable kind of way of expressing competition. However, when it's between groups of religious groups or minority groups or racial groups, this increased competition can breed hostility, prejudice, discrimination, and even in some cases, war. Now, continuing on with theories relative to prejudice and discrimination is one that's called the social cognitive theory. And this is the mental process that people use to notice, interpret, and even remember information about the social world. Processes used to simplify and categorize, usually, in order for the social world, in the order that the social world are the same process distorts the view of it. So basically, we try to simplify a complex world by organizing our social world in our mind in a manner that simplifies and categorizes. And sometimes by categorizing, we generate stereotypes. And stereotypes are widely shared beliefs about the characteristic traits, the attitudes, and behaviors of members of various social groups, whether they be ethnic, racial, or religious. This includes the assumption that members of such groups are usually all alike. Now that's kind of an odd thing to say, because we would certainly be able to say with pretty much certainty that people who belong to the social group or the religious groups or the racial group that I belong to are no more alike as any other group would be. People who are like me are just as different as I know that everybody else of every other group are as different and widespread. So when we think in terms of this, people attend to information that confirms stereotypes. We tend to pay attention to things that support what we already think we know. More diversity is perceived to the in-group as more similar among almost all out-group members. This can be based on gender, age, or other characteristics. They all look the same to me is sometimes a comment you'll hear when people are describing stereotypes. Age stereotypes can also be more pronounced than gender in some cases. Now, taking a decidedly different tact here, one of the areas that's been taking new focus in social psychology is the area of pro-social behavior. Pro-social behavior is the kind of behavior that benefits other people. It's such as helping, cooperation, and sympathy. Young children usually respond sympathetically into companions that are in distress before their second birthday. Now, reasons for helping, well, there's altruism. This is that behavior that we exhibit that is aimed at helping other people, where it requires some degree of sacrifice maybe in our part, but there's no personal gain being achieved by doing that. So altruism is reaching out to help where you're not looking for something in return. Empathy is the ability to take the perspective of another person. Now, this doesn't mean you can know what they feel. It just means that you make every effort to understand and put yourself in their shoes, not trying to color it with your perspective. Commitment is where we're more likely to behave altruistically when commitment is high. We're more likely to donate to a family member than to a stranger. And so when we have a relationship with somebody, our degree of prosocial behavior is certainly increased. And social responsibility norms, they vary from culture to culture. In the United States, people there are more likely to help anyone in a life-threatening situation, same as that in North America and Canada and many other European countries, but only family members in moderately dangerous situations. It's kind of an ironic situation. Now, along with this pro-social perspective that we are relatively to very helpful people, there is a condition or a circumstance that's called bystander effect. And the experience goes like this. As the number of bystanders at an emergency increases, the probability that the victim will receive help from them decreases. And the help, if given, is likely to be delayed. Now, it seems particularly odd that the more people who are witness to an accident or witness to a crime or witness to an emergency, the less likely anyone is to step forward. And it's called the bystander effect. Now, part of it is it's what's called the diffusion of responsibility. The feeling among the bystanders at the emergency is that the responsibility for helping is shared by the group. Someone else is bound to do something. Makes each person feel less compelled to act than if he or she was there alone and bore the entire responsibility, where the sense would be, I must help, no one else can. So when others seem calm, common to conclude that nothing is wrong and no intervention is necessary. And so the bystander effect, there is a solution to that, and essentially it is about taking responsibility and giving people instructions about what to do. But one person needs to take responsibility and the rest will follow. The last little piece that we'll touch base on in regards to the area of social psychology is the topic of aggression. Aggression is the intentional infliction of physical or psychological discomfort or pain to others. And it can take many forms in a variety of different locations. It can be something that occurs at home, something that occurs at work, on the road in your car, at the sports field, and spectators in a variety of places. And of course, there's different theories on it. Freud had his theory, and he looked at what was called instinct theory. And basically, it turned inward as self-destruction. It turned outward as aggression or violence towards other people. Konrad Lorenz, he was the biologist who looked at salivating dogs and the learning theory. He had saw aggression as an inborn fighting instinct in which many animal species. More social psychologists view aggression to be much more complex than that. The genetic perspective, it looks at the study in twins where it estimates heredity is about half, 50% for aggression and 50% for learning. The link for criminal behavior is also established, where adoptees with criminal biological parents are 4 times more likely to commit crimes than the biological children. Genes may increase sensitivity to models of aggression, that is, to be more receptive to them. Low arousal of the autonomic nervous system is linked to the antisocial and violent behavior, where they seek stimulation and excitement and exhibit fearlessness in the face of danger. Now, more specifically, when we look at some of the possible links, hereditary is considered some of the most fairly compelling. It's one where one identical twin is aggressive, there's a 50% chance that the other twin is aggressive as well. Adopted children's aggressive tendencies are more like those of biological parents than their adopted parents, which suggests more the natural nurturing part of who you're growing up with, not so much what your hereditary, what your heredity was. Now, there's also this argument around low arousal, and people with low levels of arousal seek stimulation. So because they have lower levels of arousal, they seek things that are more stimulating and more exciting, and it increases their arousal. And this could include aggression. In addition, high testosterone or high levels of testosterone has been correlated testosterone with some forms of aggression, such as the intimate partner abuse and in both men and women. There is also neurological explanation for aggression. Some brain tumors and other neurological diseases have disorders and disorders have been linked to aggressive behavior. And we may know many people where alcohol abuse, people who are intoxicated, commit the majority of murders and most of the violent crimes in North American society. Now we carry on with other influences we have a frustration aggression hypothesis, and social psychologists here view frustration as frustration produces the aggression. It's likely it is, if it's intense, seems unjustified and arouses a negative emotion, things like pain, loud noise, bad odors, and extreme heat are linked to aggression because it creates frustration. And it's that frustration that from this frustration aggression hypothesis that produces the aggressive response. In conjunction with this is what's called scapegoating. This is where we displace our aggression onto members of a minority group or onto other innocent targets not responsible for the frustrating situation. Children angry at parents may take it out on a younger sibling, and that's displacement, also known as scapegoating. And then the last area is what we know as social learning theory of aggression, and this is a lot of work that was done by Bandura. People learn to behave aggressively by observing aggressive models and by having their aggressive responses reinforced. Higher rates among groups and cultures that condone aggression. Bandura's work, well, he believed that role models, family, and media elevate aggression. 1/3 of abused people go on to become abusers. 1/3 do not, and 1/3 may if stress levels are high enough. Majority of abused and neglected children do not become abusive themselves. Some of those people who have been abused become more withdrawn or isolated or passive. Media violence enhances children's and adolescent aggressive interactions with strangers, classmates, and friends. Now, the research is mixed on this. Some of the research has been more suggested that people already who have aggressive tendencies, video games or aggressive programming, can stimulate that further. But if you don't already have those aggressive tendencies, the video games and aggressive TV programs aren't going to do that to you. So it really kind of depends on a lot of other issues, and certainly aggression isn't all that well understood in terms of theoretically or in terms of practically where does it come from and how is it maintained, aside from some of the social experiences and how it might be reinforced. So I hope this has been interesting. Social psychology is an interesting segment of psychology. We are now finishing up the first half of the semester, and we'll be beginning 8th semester after your break away. So enjoy your break. Get some work done and relax a little bit, and we'll see you back in week 8.